Well, welcome back. It's part 2 with Chris Rbertshaw, ex-MHK, defender of the faith in the sense of right and wrong. And boy, we've talked about this whole thing with Dr. Ranson for so long. But the Richard Wright KC report, which came out at the end of January, is really what you're honing in on. What it highlighted, what it suggested. But in this one, you want to deal with the failings of the AG. I mean, you've done them so many times in the past. The poor people there probably going to go mad that you're going to do another go at them. But
very, very few people will have read this report. I don't know whether all the MHKs and MLCs have actually read the full report. I hope they have. Right. And I hope they're worried about it. They need to be. But what I'd like to do, if I may, Paul, is go through the failings of the AG's department.
As mentioned by KC Richard Wright.
As in his report?
Yes.
Okay. So paragraph 232, for those who want to look it up, to double check that what I'm saying is correct. 1, a failure to treat the litigation as seriously as it should have been from the outset of the claim. 2, a consequent failure to properly resource the preparation of the defence of the litigation, both in terms of capacity and specialist expertise. 3, a failure to instruct counsel at an early stage. 4, a lack of critical scrutiny of the case as the litigation developed.
Wow, here we go.
5, a failure to set the disclosure process in train at an early juncture. 6, a failure to provide formal, detailed disclosure advice. That was a major issue.
Yes.
As you recall. 7, a failure to agree search terms and a framework for disclosure with the claimant. 8, a delegation of the disclosure exercise to the DHSC so that it was client rather than lawyer led. Interesting point. Mm-hmm. The controlling hand all the way through this, in almost every aspect, is, bear in mind, is the AG's department. And you know I've said that to you many times in the past. 9, a failure to critically scrutinise the material produced by DHSC before it was sent to the claimant. 10, a failure to maintain an audit trail of material generated, reviewed and disclosed. 11, a failure to assist and prepare the witness for the hearing on the 7th of January in terms of drafting her affidavit and providing advice as to the likely issues and the nature of the hearing that was about to occur. Now, there's more.
There's more.
Oh gosh, there's more. Paragraph 105 in the report. Richard Knight says, "It's clear to me that there was little, if any, consideration of the potential for this claim and the resulting proceedings before the tribunal to gain the significance that it did, both in terms of potential financial liability of the government and the potential reputational damage that the claim could inflict upon not just the DHSC, which it has done, because the name of our health service now outside of the Isle of Man is very poor and is significantly impacting recruiting, which impacts upon every individual on the Isle of Man in terms of the medical service that we get. And that's how guilty.
And I've heard that from very high sources.
I'm sure
they are having massive problems because people see our videos and other videos and all this goes on. Google anything now about this case.
And the source of all of this was the arrogance of the AG's department, who kept on pushing forward. Disgraceful. I consider, this is Richard Knight now, I consider that to be a surprising lack of appreciation and a complacency of approach, which meant from the outset the claim and the response of the DHSC to it was not handled with the resource, expertise and sensitivity that it should have been. The AG's department has 75 people in it. To people like me, even before it went to litigation, it was self-evident that this was a serious issue. Excuse me, serious issue.
Yeah, well,
and needed total focus, and we were discussing it well before it went to litigation.
Everything mentioned on that first one particularly, we sat and did programmes about exactly those subjects, as it was a live case, you know.
Yeah, and even before it got to litigation, we were saying, for goodness sake, don't let this go
any further.
And ignored it. Now, right.
Bring back a lot of memories, this now.
Yes. Paragraph 106. This was, even on cursory examination, a whistleblowing claim being made by a very senior civil servant that concerned, at least in part, the advice she had given to the government during the island's response to COVID-19 pandemic, and criticism of the way in which that advice had been handled. You remember all that, of course. Yeah. It should have been obvious that the allegations were likely to attract significant publicity, that the financial consequences of losing the claim may have been significant, and that the risk of reputational damage was high, with the resulting risk of a loss of public confidence in the DHSC and potentially wider government. The case should have been identified as one of significance at the outset, and decision-making in the litigation should have been conducted with an appreciation of that potential significance. And there's a particular point I want to make here. I absolutely agree with that, and it should have been obvious. It was obvious to lay people like us that government was heading for a massive fall and dragging an awful lot of good issues down around it. But the point is, what I want to say here, which is why it's not just about Ross and Ranson, and it's not, or COVID, and it's not. It's about how the AGs deal with matters. And here, in this particular paragraph, there's a reference to whistleblowers. Now, if the AG's department is unaccountable and is acting in this high-handed, aggressive, arrogant manner, that's how anybody within government who works in government may be treated if they believe in all sincerity that they need to whistleblow. They will not be treated fairly. Now, until such time as the AG's department becomes totally accountable for the way it deals with these sort of issues, very much focused on whistleblowers, then it's perfectly reasonable for every single member of government, 8,000 or whatever there is, to have no confidence in its employer. And I've heard MHK saying, oh, we've got to improve culture. Well, let me tell them now that if they want to improve culture, they deal with the Attorney General's office and they make sure that whistleblowers get treated fairly.
How do they get accountability, though? How can you give them accountability? They can't. At the minute, they're judge and jury themselves, aren't they? I mean, you're
dragging me into part 3 now.
Okay. Can I? If you done that, more? There's more. Oh my gosh.
No, there's more.
Keep going.
Right. Now, inside the Richard Wright's report, we deal with the tribunal's observations with regard to how they saw the case actually conducted. And there are 9 observations, and they're very short.
Yeah.
So, 1, a late application was made to amend the claim, which could and should have been made much sooner than it was. That's all about the fact that well into the whole case in front of the tribunal, government, the AG's department, effectively decided, oh, well, that won't work, we'll try this. So they tried to change the rules. I mean, disgraceful. 2, a miscarriage of justice. Listen to this one. A miscarriage of justice. I'll say that again. A miscarriage of justice had only been avoided by Dr. Ranson making her own request for information under Freedom of Information provisions for material that the DHSC had not provided and disclosure.
And that's just so disgraceful. I mean, what I was going to say.
What can you say to that?
I'm going to say what I've been thinking since you started this. It's our version of the post office v.
It is
Fujitsu / the whole thing of they were so far down a path they just couldn't stop themselves. Remember?
Absolute arrogance.
This is exactly the same.
It is.
That they just kept going when they should have.
Absolutely.
Oh gosh.
Absolutely. 3, disclosure was made late and continued during the hearing. In other words, you and I saw stuff coming in that the AG's department should have full well known that these matters should have been put together properly. In fact, I'm saying something Richard Wright has already said here, which is disclosure issues are absolutely crucial to a case.
Because again, like I learned from the post office thing, was it doesn't matter if it's in your favour or against you, you have to disclose. But of course, there's a feeling there that people don't necessarily want to give certain stuff out.
Absolutely.
But that's not the way it's meant to work, is it?
4, I don't think I've said this already. The disclosure exercise conducted by DHSC was generally deficient. 5, disclosure had been selective. Goodness me, that's your point.
The same point, yeah.
With relevant material deliberately withheld.
That's huge to say that, though, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, in the actual report,
Yeah.
somebody somewhere should be, falling their sword, I'd have thought.
Documents, well, what should happen now? It's not about, as it were, the retrospective blame game. It's about Tynwald picking this up and dealing with it. If Tynwald doesn't deal with this, remember the Chief Minister passed this matter to Tynwald and said, look at this and bring your reports forward, which they've done, but unfortunately the report is weak in its conclusions, even though its observations are excellent.
Keep going with these ones.
Okay.
The rest of another 4 to go.
So, 6. Documents may have been relied upon by DHSC that had been deliberately concocted or manipulated in some ways. We've got to leave that as a question mark because that was never resolved, but that was a point that was contentious.
Was he saying that happened, or was he just suggesting?
No, he's not.
He's not.
May have been. So,
may have. Oh,
right, okay. Yeah. That's what caused a great deal of concern, and it's unfortunate that there was some question mark afterwards that the tribunal should not really be having a special hearing to look at the whole issue of disclosures. Well, in fact, I don't know how else Douglas Stewart and the rest of the tribunal team could have handled this had they not asked for that. But anyway, we'll move on from there because that's not, as it were, focused at the centre of this particular discussion. 7. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There were several instances of documents that were still missing or were in the possession of Manx Care and had not been disclosed. 8. A failure by Catherine Magson to provide her daybooks and in particular the notes of the Grantham meeting.
Now that in itself was, if you can follow that one, how things weren't kept. No, there's no records.
Well, they
were, but then they couldn't find them. Or they were.
No, tribunal said there wasn't initially. The tribunal were told there wasn't, and then hey-ho, it appeared. Yeah. Goodness me. 9. A failure by the DHSC lawyers to probe and challenge the obvious gaps in disclosure. Now, we go on to some other fails here. This is paragraph 36, as I recall. Item 5. And again, people can look this report up if they wish. If they go onto the Tynwald site, you can find the Tynwald Hansards and the reports, etc. Item 5. The management of disclosure by the Attorney General's Chamber fell far below the standards required. Think about that.
Yeah, it's huge. That's huge.
The failures in disclosure were the single most significant factor in the negative outcome of the litigation from the perspective of DHSC. The disclosure failings also had a significant effect upon Dr. Ranson and her mental health, which we full well know happened. And 7. The paragraph 33 appeal exposed a conflict between the narrow interests of the DHSC and the wider interests of the government of the Isle of Man. The decision-making surrounding the decision to pursue this appeal lacked clarity and openness. Further, the manner in which the decision was taken to lodge the skeletal arguments reveals that good governance had broken down in the DHSC at the time. And of course, remember Rob Collister went in to that department. At that particular stage, Laurie Hooper was removed. I remember very well talking to Laurie Hooper as you and I left one of those tribunal sessions, and I said to Laurie, why on earth have you not, it was in the street we met, why on earth have you know the truth around this case? Because when I took the Dr. Ranson case to the Public Accounts Committee well before all of this, so it was all available to everybody. He was the Vice Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. He was party to the report that the Public Accounts Committee ultimately submitted into the public arena. He knew the truth. And I said to him, now you're the Minister of Health, why haven't you, as it were, interceded and dealt with this and done what effectively Richard Wright calls you to do, which is to resolve the matter before it goes to litigation. And he just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, it's an employment issue and it's out of my hands. And I just looked at him and walked away. And I thought, what an abrogation of responsibility that was. He was removed. Rob Collister was posted into what we now know, according to the Richard Wright KC. Further, the manner in which the decision was taken to lodge the skeleton arguments reveals that good governance had broken down in the DHSC at that time. Rob Collister carried the can for that.
Oh, yeah.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, remember I monitored this all the way through. I believe Rob Collister did his best to resolve these matters, and he was ripped apart by his own department. And I'll explain that to a committee of Tynwald if they wish me to do it.
But also, it goes higher than that, because obviously Alf Cannon got involved in a bit of that proceedings as well, didn't he?
Exactly.
But when they couldn't find Mr. Collister to sign off on something, it was a long.
And another fail.
Okay.
It goes on and on, doesn't it? The Attorney General's chambers failed to appreciate the significance and complexity of this claim from the outset, and that was sort of dealt with elsewhere. They also failed to grasp the potential for significant reputational damage arising from these proceedings for both the DHSC and the wider Isle of Man government. In consequence, the defence of the claim was under-resourced throughout, and the lack of resource was a major contributory factor to the loss of litigation. Now, I believe this is where Richard Wright starts to go wrong. Is he really saying that the whole issue with this myriad of fails is down to money? Because on that basis, all he's doing is what Beamans have incessantly done whenever government calls an external body in to review things. The answer is always make the department bigger or spend more money. It is not the answer. First of all, stop asking people like Beamans to do these reviews. And stop asking people to review what the Isle of Man's doing when they're coming from much bigger jurisdictions where these sort of issues aren't in question. Right now, our departments are far too big, and they're trying to do far too many things, and they need more and more money to do it. And as a consequence, in budgetary terms, we're floundering. And we're not hearing from Tynwald that it's getting to grips with this at all. That you've got 75 people. It's not money, it's arrogance, control. It's having too much influence, and there are other ways forward. So I think maybe, unless you've got some questions.
Only the fact is, you're saying all this and bringing it back up, which is incredible, because I must admit, I forgot some of this. I said at the beginning, people don't almost forget about this thing, but the fact is this can't go away. There has to be some sort of, result on making things better.
Well, that's what we'll deal in
part 3
in the last 3. But after all of that, what Richard Wright says, this is where Richard Wright, in part, it's a sort of good and bad report. It has excellent parts in it, and then after all that I've just said there, his conclusion at 36.1, summary of conclusions. As an overarching conclusion, I am satisfied that the defence of the litigation by DHSC was conducted in good faith. How the hell he could...
He's saying that's incredible to say that, because he's just been listing all the reasons they were.
I think in the end it became lost. I think that's what it was,
or sweetening the pill slightly.
What?
Well, he's had a good go.
There are one or two people whose view I respect, who amusingly call it this report a Wright-wash, as opposed to a whitewash.
How much that cost? Do you know? Remember how much this report cost?
No.
Was it a pretty big one?
Well, the cost of letting this happen has been absolutely enormous. Not just the money that had to be paid out, not just the costs, their additional accumulated costs that they incurred in their pathetic and arrogant defence, but the damage it's done to the health service and the reputation of the Isle of Man. Just absolutely enormous. When is Tynwald going to get to grips with this? And shall we try and deal with it in part 3?
Part 3 coming next.